Binding Blade's Elffin is an optional character who has always ranked among the game's most interesting for me. Despite being entirely possible to miss, he ties in deeply with the game's lore and actually gets a very solid arc all to himself, even if a lot of it takes place entirely off-screen and requires a little bit of assembly to fully see. But that's where I step in. Putting the pieces together and combining Elffin's story into a singular cohesive narrative just seemed like a really fun topic for a video, so here we are. Unlike many of the characters that I typically take a look at, I feel like Elffin actually has a pretty solid fanbase in the community, which is shocking for a Dots video subject since I tend to look at characters who average somewhere in the vicinity of around 11 fans in the entire universe. But with that said, I do feel like there's always room to bring more attention to any given character. I mean, at the time of writing this video script, Elffin still hasn't even managed to get into Fire Emblem Heroes yet, although I personally hope that that's going to change soon. Admittedly, a little bit of his character is just a bit subtextual. There's a decent bit of reading between the lines that I think you need to do to really get into some of the specifics for Elffin as a character, but that's kind of why I found him so interesting to take a look at. Hopefully that doesn't make me come across as too pedantic, or, like the dreaded English major. Elffin is a bard and one of 2 available dancers in Binding Blade. He speaks with an air of nobility, which nearly exposes his hidden identity at times. He's presented as clever, wise, pragmatic, determined, and passionate as he helps to fight for the liberation of the Western Isles. To those ends, he's shown to deeply care for the people as he learns more about their struggles and he puts his life on the line for their sake. Interestingly enough, given that he's honestly fairly lore relevant, Elffin is actually totally optional, and in fact I see people miss him more often than not when I see people playing FE6. Binding Blade has a route split between 2 routes colloquially labeled A and B, and Elffin only becomes playable on the B route, which is generally considered to be the less desirable of the 2. With that said, he does still appear as a fortune teller should the player opt for the A route. It's a much less significant role, but I do appreciate that he's at least still there. As a lot of players know by now though, Elffin's identity is actually a front, something that quickly becomes apparent in the majority of his supports. In truth, he is in fact Myrddin, the prince of the kingdom of Etruria who is thought to have been assassinated by a poisoned arrow. A trusted retainer, Douglas, rescued him from near death, helped him to fake his death, and entrusted his recovery to the care of his daughter Larum. Though he survived the assassination attempt, it left him near death for months, to the point where Larum nearly gave up on him several times. The poison also led him to be temporarily blinded and to still experience occasional bouts of vision loss even after recovering. To protect his identity, he went into hiding and is reluctant to reveal his identity to anyone but his most trusted friends and confidants. At some point following this, Elffin managed to become one of the leading forces of the resistance faction of the Western Isles in their struggle against the oppressive Etruria. The full structure of the resistance is admittedly a little vague, but my assumption is that Elffin is the head strategist of the group based on his role later in the game. If you've been paying attention thus far, something might have already stood out to you. Yes, Elffin is both the Prince of Etruria and helping to lead a resistance effort that directly opposes it at the same time. Because of this, I feel like it's probably important to give a little bit more information about Etruria as a whole in order to fully contextualize Elffin's role in the story. Throughout both Eleb games, Etruria is kind of on the outskirts of the story, aside from a small arc around the middle of Binding Blade. It's presented as one of the largest and most powerful countries on the continent of Eleb, as well as an artistic and cultural powerhouse that houses the Elamine Church, a major central figure in both Eleb games. Etruria usually stands as an ally to Lycia, the territory that houses most of the major characters across the 2 games. However, following the presumed death of his son, Mordred, the king of Etruria, fell into a terrible state of depression and largely withdrew from politics, effectively leaving 2 corrupt nobles in charge, which went about as well as you'd expect it to. The nobles soon began to plot to align Etruria with Bern, the largely antagonistic nation of the game, in order to take over the entire continent of Eleb. Moreover, these nobles are involved with the exploitation of the Western Isles, which brings about the rebellion that Elffin is involved with. After Elffin was rescued from his attempted assassination by Douglas and Larum, he witnessed the terrible treatment of the people of the Western Isles for himself, including how citizens were taken from their families and worked to death to mine expensive minerals for nobles. This is a major catalyst for a few different points of interest in his writing, but we'll get to those shortly. The player first sees an injured Elffin as he's fleeing from the Etrurian nobles in their efforts to wipe out the resistance forces. He's rescued by friendly villagers who help him to recover, but he quickly deduces that the Etrurian forces will likely raise the entire village in order to eliminate him as a major player in the resistance. And he is unfortunately soon proven to be correct, as one of the nobles decides to burn the entire village simply to get rid of Elffin. However, Roy's army intervenes and pushes the Etrurian forces back, rescuing both Elffin and the village. When Elffin first encounters Roy, he tests him by intentionally slanting information about Etruria's intentions to see whether or not Roy will overreact to it. When Roy judges it logically and decides to stay in order to help the people of the Western Isles, Elffin deems him to be a level-headed leader and commits himself to Roy's cause, becoming something of a strategist and informant in the Western Isles and beyond, as well as using his abilities with the harp to help support his allies in battle. Unlike numerous other characters in the series, Elffin doesn't actually disappear from the story after he joins the player's army. I mean, he's not exactly a huge presence, but he is given a few moments throughout the game to pop in and explain some lore or allude to his hidden identity in some way. Given that Binding Blade loves to give all of its story content to Roy and Merlinus, I definitely appreciate that someone else is allowed to actually exist in the plot. Sometimes. With that said, I'd still like to largely shift focus over to his supports as we look at his characterization from this point forward. Many of Elffin's supports present him as open-minded and friendly, yet somewhat reserved. While his Fae support is largely inconsequential to his overall narrative, she does readily approach him and seems at ease around him, while he humors her childlike whims and seems to treat her with a degree of respect. His Klein support also hints at a close friendship between the two despite their different stations, but we'll discuss that a little bit more in just a minute. Many of his other supports show him as a respectful and thoughtful young man who does not treat others as lesser despite his social status as a prince. Understandably, the vast majority of Elffin's supports tie into Etruria and his conflicting feelings regarding both the state of his kingdom and his future role in it. A small yet important element of this is guilt. Elffin alludes to the guilt that he feels for the situation with Etruria during Percival's recruitment conversation and later in his supports with Douglas, and I believe that this guilt is an important part of his character despite being somewhat understated. Elffin is intrinsically tied to Etruria, and I interpret him as feeling that its failings are his own. Elffin seemed to formerly believe that Etruria truly was what it appeared to be on the surface, a leading kingdom in all respects and likely one that could do no wrong. Yet after surviving his assassination attempt and mingling with the people, he became disillusioned and realized that corruption had always been rampant within his kingdom, and that it had only grown worse following his father's withdrawal from politics in the wake of his own alleged assassination. He seems to truly regret his former ignorance and his own powerlessness to help the citizens of his kingdom. What intrigues me the most here, though, is that Elffin doesn't buckle under the weight of his country's sins and his own feelings of guilt toward them, but instead uses his feelings as fuel to earnestly fight for the citizens. It would have been easy for him to just run away from his troubles, truly becoming the wandering bard that he pretends to be, or to just live in hiding somewhere. Instead, he continues to put his life on the line to fight against his very kingdom. Even during his first conversation in the game, he's being hunted and is clearly heavily injured. Yet he cares more for the safety of the people around him than for his own life, and would prefer to leave for their protection instead of staying and resting. I really love this element of raw grit and determination from royalty who truly wants to fix the problems that his kingdom is causing. I feel obligated to contrast this attitude with another Fire Emblem character, Lewin. Both are princes who are met under the guise of being traveling bards. However, where Lewin is unambiguously fleeing from his responsibilities and only undergoes a change of heart after someone close to him dies, Elffin sees the corruption in his kingdom and immediately resolves to take action. He truly fights to fix the issues that he sees and demonstrates a hell of a lot of resolve in doing so. Don't get me wrong, I adore Lewin, but it was hard not to note this comparison when summarizing Elffin's storyline, and I think it really helps to highlight his strength as a character. Despite this strength of character though, a number of his supports actually show his hesitation to return to Etruria. Many different characters request that he return to the throne, yet he consistently hesitates to do so, and he even continues to hide his identity from some of them, such as Cecilia. Of course, there is an obvious surface-level explanation for his hesitation here. If the assassins learn that he survived, they would almost certainly target him again, and he fears that they could go after those around him as well. However, I believe that there is a little bit more to delve into here regarding his hesitation to pick up his old identity as Myrddin. Namely, I interpret his previously mentioned guilt as a major driving factor that holds him back from associating with his true identity as a prince. Even in private, he tells Klein not to address him with any titles that could associate him with his station as prince. I read much of his hesitation to return to his status as him not wishing to own the title until he can fully atone and set things right. Despite this, I actually feel like his insistence in hiding his identity ironically shows a degree of inner strength in its own way. While he's given many opportunities to return to the throne or to turn to trusted vassals for help, he's hesitant to do so, choosing not to pull others into his own problems or even to force his father to grieve a second time should they be forced apart again. Though he's clearly relieved when he's able to talk to his former friends, notably Klein, he actively maintains his own isolation in order to protect them as he feels he needs to. Ultimately, Elffin does commit to returning to Etruria near the end of several of his supports. However, he indicates to Percival that he wishes to continue traveling and seeing the world before returning for good. According to his character ending, he returned a number of months after the events of the game, indicating that he did indeed continue his travels before resuming his life as royalty. Despite being shown to be rather wise already, it's clear that he's aware of how much more he has to learn about the world, and he wants to see more and continue to learn more about the struggles of the people before returning to Etruria once and for all, as the most capable leader that he can be. Even after helping to end the war, he wishes to continue to learn and grow. Though he's portrayed as quite knowledgeable and clever in the events that we witness in Binding Blade, there is some evidence that points to Elffin formerly being rather sheltered, if not outright naive. As previously mentioned, he openly admits to having no idea about the true extent of Etruria's corruption prior to his assassination attempt. Furthermore, as a child, he had been naive enough to demand that Klein become his brother after the two grew close, something that he looks back on with a good deal of embarrassment. It's admittedly not much, but it does paint the picture of Elffin being rather naive prior to him seeing the true nature of his kingdom. This contrasts nicely with the Elffin that we see in the story, who is shown to be pragmatic and wise with a real inner strength. It's clear that his brush with death truly helped him to grow up, and as much as I'm hesitant to point out the obvious with a slightly cheesy line, it took him being blinded to truly open his eyes to the truths of the world. While it is off-screen development, it's interesting nonetheless, and I really appreciate the glimpses that we get of Elffin before the events of the game to really drive home how much he was changed as he saw the atrocities in the Western Isles. Even as he grows and fights for the people, Elffin is shown to still be quite humble, as he openly accepts his own shortcomings as a leader. With how the political situation in the League plays out across Binding Blade, Elffin could well have simply retaken the throne after the war and asserted Etruria as the strongest nation in the League once Bern fell. Yet, as the game progresses and he sees Roy's leadership in action, he begins to doubt his own political abilities and eventually concedes that Roy is the more capable leader. He eventually concludes that Roy should be the one to lead Alib into an era of peace, rejecting the power and status that could come from asserting himself as leader of the entire continent. Presumably, he allows Lycia to lead the continent instead, but I will admit that Binding Blade's ending is a little bit unclear on this point, so I'm not 100% certain on this. As a small and slightly self-indulgent side note, I must say that I really enjoy how Elffin's role as a dancer has a ludonarrative tie-in to his overall role in the story. The Elffin that we see throughout the story is humble and willing to let others who are more capable get the glory. He's a wise strategist who stands back and helps the army to be more efficient despite his own physical frailty. This kind of relates to the role of a dancer. They're never going to shine in combat or rack up kills like most of the rest of your units will, but they are nonetheless an invaluable part of the army, support units who inherently make others stronger and more efficient. It's a nice connection with his role as a strategist in the background, as well as his later decision to step aside and let someone else lead the continent. It's a smaller detail, but I just kind of thought it was neat how his role in gameplay really ties into his larger role in the plot. Elffin is a character that I honestly believe could work as the main character of a Fire Emblem game. Though much of his arc is off-screen, I really do appreciate what we learn of it. He was formerly a naive prince who was unaware of the corruption infesting his kingdom or how his people suffered. But after narrowly surviving an assassination attempt, he was able to truly see and understand the harsh state of the world, particularly in regards to how the people of the Western Isles were treated. Following this, he integrated himself into a resistance effort, putting his life on the line to fix the issues that his kingdom caused instead of running away from his problems, all while struggling with the idea of reclaiming his former identity and returning to his former station. He's a clever, calculating man who helps plot out Roy's path to victory, yet beyond that, he's humble and kind, willing to accept his own shortcomings and cede power to someone more capable when necessary. He cares deeply for his friends, his retainers, and his father, choosing to endure isolation for their sake. Yet more than this, he truly cares for the citizens and wishes to aid those who suffer. At his core, Elffin truly wishes to learn and grow, to be the best leader possible. And honestly, Elffin is just a super cool character all around, and one that I'm a little bit sad about being totally optional and on a route that's a little bit less popular. I loved his design and personality from the onset, and that appreciation only grew once I learned more about him and saw his inner strength through his circumstances throughout the game. I definitely feel like Elffin has gotten a little bit more love in the community over recent years, but I am always willing to help highlight a character who I truly believe to be one of Binding Blade's most interesting and well written.